Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Public Funds, Public Schools webinar, Protect Public Education, Everything to Know About Private Education Vouchers Now. I'm Jessica Levin from Education Law Center, and I direct Public Funds, Public Schools, which is a national campaign to ensure that public funds for education are used to support and strengthen public schools and are not diverted to private education uses like vouchers. The purpose of today's webinar is to give you the latest updates on vouchers at both the state and federal levels and provide useful, practical information and tips to help those across the country who are opposing these harmful programs. We are so lucky to have three of the country's top voucher experts and advocates for public schools here today with us. Fred Jones is the Senior Director of Public Policy and Advocacy for the Southern Education Foundation. Paige Duggins-Clay is an attorney and chief legal analyst for the civil rights organization IDRA. And Dr. Josh Cowen is professor of education policy at Michigan State University and currently a visiting senior fellow at Education Law Center. And their fuller bios are being dropped in the chat. Thank you so much to our speakers and our audience for being here today. We know what a busy time it is for everyone. Today's webinar will be recorded and posted on the PFPS website. Please put your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat, and we'll have plenty of time for questions toward the end of the webinar. Now, before I turn to our panel, I want to briefly address the latest developments at the federal level, which I know are on everyone's mind, and we also certainly hear the thoughts and insights from the panel on this. As we speak, as I understand it, President Trump may be signing an executive order meant to dismantle the U.S. Department of Education. Education Law Center and many others have released statements condemning this misguided action, which would be catastrophic for students around the country, particularly the most vulnerable. We, and I know others, will be closely monitoring and analyzing that. And specifically relevant to vouchers, we know that attacks on our public education institutions, like the Department of Education, are part of the push for education privatization, at the same time that privatization is part of the multi-pronged attack on public education across the country. So a very dangerous feedback loop. In addition to that potential executive order today, almost 2 months ago, President Trump issued another executive order directing several federal agencies, including but not limited to the Department of Education, to submit plans on how to use the funding streams that they administer to support vouchers, and including some very large funding streams that are supposed to be directed to public school students and to our most vulnerable children. The first of those plans from executive agencies are due very shortly, and that's another thing to watch closely. In addition, we are awaiting a budget reconciliation bill from Congress, and many are engaging in advocacy to prevent the federal voucher bill, the Educational Choice for Children Act, or ECHA, from being included in that legislation. And we'll be, again, happy to talk about these federal developments and how they relate to states and kids across the country. But now we're going to hear about state updates and the latest advocacy tools from our panel, starting with Fred Jones of Southern Education Foundation. And I know that before Fred turns to the latest across the South, he's also going to go back in time for a moment and refresh us on the origins of modern vouchers, really crucial info for everybody. So please take it away, Fred.
Thank you, Jessica. I really appreciate the opening remarks. As you all know, or as you may know, my name is Fred Jones. I'm the Senior Director of Public Policy and Advocacy at the Southern Education Foundation. I wanted to walk you just through a few slides, and I'm hoping we can pull those up now. But as that's going up, I just wanted to let you know that I've been at the Southern Education Foundation now for a few years, leading our advocacy and policy development division. And so I was asked to kind of give a broad historical overview of how school vouchers developed, and also give you the latest update of where we are, at least from a Southern perspective, with the developments of school vouchers in the South. Go to the next slide, please. And so what I wanted to make sure, I wanted to frame my comments really around these points. Oftentimes, I just wanted to share the 6 most critical reasons to oppose school vouchers, at least from SEF standpoint, and what we advocate for and what we hear with our peers. School vouchers really emerge from a racist origin. Oftentimes, they're inefficient and duplicative. They lack accountability. They don't have universal accessibility. Oftentimes, kids lose their civil rights. And most importantly, at least to me, they fail to improve academic performance. Now, they're not listed necessarily in order of priority, but these are certainly the arguments that we center on the reasons why to oppose vouchers. However, just for my time today, I'm going to really just really hone in on that first point, how these school vouchers really emerge from a racist origin in response to the Brown versus Board of Education. If we go to the next slide. So I just put that really in red here. But in terms of just really bringing us back from a moment in time, I wanted to talk about really during the Civil War and right before the Civil War, just to remind people, it was illegal for enslaved people, Black enslaved people in the United States to learn how to read and write. So after the Civil War, there was really two main things that the formerly enslaved population wanted to do. They wanted to establish their own form of religion or practice their own form of religion. And they also wanted to establish a school system. And it was during the Reconstruction era that was Black leaders that introduced legislation and gained support at the state level to create and advance bills that created essentially a tax for the school system, for a public school system to be created in the South. And so they updated the constitutions, led efforts to update the Constitution, and also led efforts to make sure that there was funding for public schools. Now, those public schools were segregated, but they were open to all, both Black and white students and all students, so that they could have a public education that was formerly denied to them during the time that they were enslaved. Next slide. So here's a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois. He says, "Public education for all at the public expense was in the South a Negro idea. At the Southern Education Foundation, oftentimes we say the gift of public education in this country and how it was founded really came and derived from Black people and Black people advocating for the development of a public school system." We go to the next slide. And really, for the purposes of the time today, because only have a limited amount of time, it's important to hear from the rest of our esteemed panel. I'm just going to start really fast forward from the Civil War really to the 1940s. In the 1940s, you start to see a real mass exodus from the public school system, especially in the South. And we saw about a 43% increase in private school enrollment because the writing started on the wall started to become very clear. At some point, our segregated school system would have to be integrated. And that took place really with the decision of Brown 1 and Brown 2, saying that separating children on the basis of race was unconstitutional. And so in preparation for that, you start to see, one, the development of many private schools across the country, and also the enrollment or the disenrollment from public schools into those private schools that were emerging at that point in time. In addition to that, you start to also see legislatures and commissions and all these state efforts to preserve segregation. There are a number of laws being passed to try to avoid school integration, but we see later in the 1950s the form of school vouchers taking place really in response to the Brown v. Board of Education decision. So we have a form in which state governments were did award scholarships, what we call really school vouchers, to white families to go to white-only institutions, white-only private schools. And these tuitions and these scholarships or school vouchers were not afforded to Black families at that point in time, nor were Black educators allowed to teach in these white-only private schools. Go to the next slide. And so we continue to see really a resistance. Private school enrollment continues to grow all throughout the South. We have 250,000 students over an 8-year period start to really enroll more in private schools. We start to continue to see local and statewide efforts to create school vouchers. We have those taking place in Virginia. We have a Georgia tax credit scholarship program, another form of a school voucher being passed. And at that point in time, it was $218,000. And if you do the math, it equates to about $3.6 million to 15,000 students today. And we continue to see other rulings, or at least rulings that vouchers cannot be lawfully used to discriminate based off of race. However, in reality, that continues to be the case in Virginia and other states where they continue to limit the school vouchers to to white families, mostly white families going to white-only private schools. Go to the next slide, please. As we continue to go forward, we see the development and expansion of private schools, specifically Segregation Academy, that is defined as private schools that were developed in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s as an alternative to going to integrated public schools. And these are typically institutions that were in the South, but they did take place all across the country. What's not on this slide is there are many public institutions and public school districts across this country that close rather than integrate. And many of the students, many of the white students did receive public funds to continue their schooling in private schools, while others in the public school system didn't have the opportunity to continue their education. In Mississippi, we see an exorbitant amount of students leaving the public school system. More so than those in Alabama and Louisiana and South Carolina, 41,000 in 1 year, exiting the public school system to go to private schools. And actually in the late 1970s, we also see the first form of a federal tax credit law being introduced in Congress and received 50 co-sponsors in the US Senate, though it did not become law. So that is quite interesting because it's still the same form of legislation that's being considered today. And then overall, just wanted to just really elevate the fact that there was such tremendous growth during these periods following the Brown v. Board of Education decision, where we have up to 750,000 students leaving the public school system and going to segregated private schools. Again, these schools oftentimes did not let in Black families or very limited Black families to access these schools as well. Next slide. So just a couple of big main takeaways. We have reported and done extensive research, which can be found on our website, that there was around almost 500 laws and or resolutions introduced in Southern states between 1954 and 1964 that worked to try to evade desegregation efforts. And then at the same time, we have the development of school vouchers being given to white families. Again, these are public dollars and public, they would say scholarships, so folks could go, white folks typically would go to white-only private schools. And the connection today is that the research shows that school vouchers really increase racial isolation and create a legal form to discriminate. Because private schools don't have to let in all types of students, they oftentimes discriminate against students who don't have or don't come from the right background, may not practice a certain religion, maybe LGBTQ plus, or other forms of discrimination such as disabilities. Students who have disabilities may not be allowed to go into the schools today with their own voucher. Go to the next slide, please. And so in terms of the South and what is situated in the South, almost every state in the South, minus the 3, and I believe that's Texas, Kentucky, and Delaware. We consider Delaware a southern state. Those are the only states that don't have a voucher currently implemented. And in 14 of these southern states, we see about tens of millions of dollars being disinvested from the public school system because these vouchers are in place. Can we, next slide, please? And even in 2025 alone, so really in the last 3 months or so, we've seen 1 state enact a school voucher in Tennessee. We have 6 states introduce legislation to establish a new school voucher, and roughly 6 states to expand an existing program. In addition to that, I think it's just troubling to me that we continue to see a focus on school vouchers, despite the facts that we know that they don't work from an academic achievement standpoint, and because they're really rooted in this racist history. We continue to see that the majority of private schools in this nation are mostly still white students, though some students of color still go to those schools, but it's overwhelmingly white, and vouchers still benefit mostly white students as well. Go to the next slide. And so this is my last slide that I'll share with you today. Our partners here in Mississippi, the Parents Campaign, actually shared this slide or this graph with us that they developed. Mississippi has a very limited school voucher program in their state, and they essentially put the NAEP results compared to Mississippi to other states that have extensive voucher programs. And they can see that Mississippi has had pretty significant growth, while other states who have a number of voucher programs saw declines in their NAEP results. The only reason I'm bringing this up today is oftentimes voucher supporters are saying that because of the NAEP results, we should try to advance school vouchers. And we know that school vouchers actually don't improve academic achievement as proved here and improved in other research as well. So I don't really think it's a good form of public policy to try to continue to advance school vouchers, even from an academic achievement standpoint, and wanted to elevate this here today because this is something that they shared with us, and I wanted to make sure we were able to share this publicly as well. And with that, I will hand this back over to Jessica. If there's anything else you'd like me to speak to, I'd love to take questions once we're all done as well. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Fred, for sharing that history and latest developments and some very troubling through lines from vouchers origins to the voucher activity we see today. And there will be plenty of time to ask Fred questions, so please drop those in the Q&A box. We're now going to hear from another all-star advocate opposing vouchers in the South, Paige Duggins-Clay, who's chief legal analyst at IDRA and recently gave testimony to the Texas legislature opposing voucher bills there. We know Texas is a must-watch state, so we're excited to hear from Paige about what's happening there and your observations on the latest voucher developments.
Thanks, Jessica. Fred, thanks for that fantastic overview. We did not coordinate it all, but I think our messages today are going to really intersect in a really interesting and helpful way. And thanks to ELC PFPS for the opportunity to have this important conversation and to spotlight the state of Texas. We are a huge holdout in terms of the policy of advancing private school vouchers, which has emerged as a priority for the far right, for various groups with a lot of different perspectives. And I think it really frustrates those advocates and voucher advocates that we've been able to hold out for as long as we have. And look, a lot of folks are talking about Texas as being a done deal, and we're here to say that's not the case. There's still a lot of great work being done and that will be done to try our best to prevent this harmful policy from happening. And don't take your eyes off us yet, because I think we have just a great strategy and a great opportunity to tell the truth about private school vouchers and the harmful impact they would have on our state. So I'm starting here today just with a reminder. This conversation is very near and dear to our hearts as IDRA, the Intercultural Development Research Association. We were founded on the premise that all children deserve to go to fully funded, fairly funded public schools to achieve equal educational opportunity. And so we take this debate seriously and have long been, leaders along with our amazing coalition and student and family and educator partners in the fight to have fair school finance in Texas. I want to give a special shout out and thank you to my beloved colleague, Dr. Chloe Latham-Sykes, who leads our work in this regard and is just a fantastic expert on the policy of vouchers in Texas and nationally. And like Fred, I find it to be very helpful and instructive to go back in time to talk about this current moment. So in my time that I have with you all, I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of our Texas school finance system and the history of this voucher policy proposal, sort of taking this bigger picture landscape that Fred offered and giving you a real life case study here in Texas. And then I'll talk about how that's playing into the sort of current state of play here in our state. A little known fact, I think, as you all may remember out there, that Texas at one point was its own nation. We were that special. And part of the rationale actually stated in our Declaration of Independence for seceding from the country of Mexico was the fact that Texans wanted a public education system. Now, that wasn't the only reason. There's many other less charitable rationales, but that was at least one of them that was enumerated here in our Declaration of Independence. We wanted, quote, a public system of education because, quote, unless a people are educated and enlightened, it's idle to expect the continuance of civil liberty or the capacity for self-government. And I think starting there is so important. This really plays into, it's not just messaging it. These are really founding principles, right? For all of us who are advocates for strong public schools, that education is the cornerstone of democracy. And our founding fathers in Texas knew and understood that. And I opened my remarks last week when I had the pleasure of sitting with my friend Josh before the Texas House Committee on Public Education. And I told the committee, look, I'm going to offer some words of wisdom from your forefathers, from the people who sat in the same chair that they are sitting in now, metaphorically, of course, debating the future of the state of the Texas school finance system. And I think what's really interesting is that for all the debates and the hours, and I think we had 4 special sessions last year, and the number of debates we've had over the decades about this policy issue. What's fascinating is our founding fathers already had it and rejected this idea, right? On the table, when the state of Texas was being founded as a nation and then later on as a state, it emerged. We were going to make good on that promise to have a public education system enshrined in our Declaration of Independence. And the architects of our state constitution actively considered whether we should sort of do what was happening at the time, which was fund sort of ad hoc the tuition and expenses of private school students across the state, whether we should have an education compulsory law at all, or whether instead we should have a public system that was open and available for all. And in fact, here's a quote from the chair of the Education Committee at that 1875 Constitutional Convention saying, look, as we are entering into this great compact, right, I boldly assert that is for the general welfare of all, rich and poor, male and female, that the means of a common school education should, if possible, be placed within the reach of every child in the state. That is the promise and the commitment that our constitutional framers put. One of the champions of that constitutional delegation that was in charge of the Public Education Committee literally looked around at his peers and said, look, guys, all of us, meaning his peers in the legislature, are actively funding, right, our own children's education. And, if we just took all the money that all of us wealthy landholding representatives were putting into our own child's private schools, we could just fund a public a public system of education. And he said this actually on the floor in the debates about pushing the adoption of Texas's education article. And I just think that is so important that we could have made a choice as a state to continue on with the status quo, but we had this bold vision that education would be the great equalizer and that we would leverage our land and our resources and ultimately our public funds to support public schools. And we got the Texas Constitution, Article 7, right? So I'm a lawyer. I'm starting with this partially because it's an area of scholarship that I'm interested in. But this is the foundation that we are really thinking about and advocating from as public school advocates in Texas who oppose vouchers, right? We know that in our Constitution, we have a mandate to provide, quote, a general diffusion of knowledge, right? And that the legislature has not just an option, right? The duty. It shall be the duty of the legislature to make suitable provision for an efficient system of public free schools, right? And in every count, by every metric, a voucher proposal fails that system, this test, right? Not efficient. $1 billion for less than 1% of the students in the state of Texas when our schools are struggling financially doesn't make sense. And you don't have to be a lawyer or a lawmaker to understand that, right? Now, just briefly touching again, reaching back to the fantastic history that Fred shared, I thought it was very interesting in Texas. There's an interesting debate as I think voucher proponents are trying to push back against the credible argument that vouchers, one, perpetuate segregation, and two, grew out of this history of racism and discrimination, right? And out of a desire to perpetuate segregation in our schools. And, look, it's a stated fact. This is a picture of our former Attorney General, John Shepard, and he wrote a brief. He didn't, it wasn't a secret. He told the U.S. Supreme Court in the context of Brown versus Board of Education that if they were forced to comply, if the state was forced to comply with integration mandates, here's exactly what the state would do. We would consider abolishing completely the free public schools, turning all the state schools into private schools, and repealing compulsory education so that and this is critical, guys. If parents desired, they could, quote, select a school in which the majority of the other pupils are of the same race or both races, thereby providing equality of opportunity and freedom of individual choice. Now, if that doesn't make you feel a little uncomfortable, you're probably not paying attention, right? That has a very eerie connotation to some of the choice and parental rights dialogue that we're having. And in fact, here in Texas, it's much more explicit. Iterations of the voucher bill, not this one, but other iterations, have actually linked quote unquote anti-CRT, anti-DEI, anti-LGBTQ plus measures, right, to the voucher. And lawmakers have certainly invoked a need to escape liberal, progressive, anti-racist lessons and curriculum training as part of the reason that we need to have vouchers. And look, I have a vested stake in this because my son Hendrix is joining me. Good job, baby. Yes, you can have a snow cone. This is why we need public schools. Uh, Jessica, with that, I'm going to hand it back to you, and I'm excited to get into the Q&A. I will just briefly remark that our current public schools are facing an incredible budget deficit, right? Our state has not increased the basic allotment since 2019. And so it's our position that already, as it stands, our Texas school finance system is underfunded and therefore unconstitutional. And adding that $1 billion voucher is really going to have a devastating impact. And just to sort of leave you all with the context is about everything you need to know about vouchers right now. There are sort of two vehicles, right? We have SB 2 passed by the Senate already in the first like 30 days of the legislative session. And that's now been sent over to the House. And we have House Bill 3, which the House is currently debating. It has not yet been passed, and they're being tinkered on. And the interesting takeaway here, and what we want our friends and advocates out there in the world is to acknowledge that the House is having a very interesting, honest conversation about what it would mean for a voucher that would actually get at the rhetoric of serving our most underserved students. So for example, this bill, the House version of the bill, has up to $30,000 for a student with a disability. They are entertaining the idea of limiting the voucher program to our neediest students. And I think that's an interesting debate, and it's going to be a very serious wedge issue. We, of course, oppose all forms of the voucher. We know it's bad policy, will perpetuate discrimination, but that tension between the House and the Senate is really a place where we're going to be spending a lot of time understanding and advocating around. And I'll hand it back to you with that, Jessica.
Thank you, Paige. That was so thorough. And we are watching and learning from the advocacy that you and your coalition partners are doing in Texas. And we, of course, are rooting for you in your defense of public schools and students. We are now going to hear from Dr. Josh Cowen, who's currently visiting senior fellow at Education Law Center. Josh has lots of experience traveling the country to hear from parents and advocates about how vouchers are or would harm their schools and students and share his expertise with them. And he's also been chronicling and analyzing state and federal voucher developments, including in his PFPS newsletter. Josh also testified in the Texas legislature last week, along with Paige. So, Josh, give us your take on this latest whirlwind of developments.
All right. Well, thanks, Jessica. Thanks, Paige. Thanks, Fred. Thanks everybody who's listening on a Thursday afternoon. Listen, I have a few things. I don't have any slides, but I have a few things I just kind of wanted to throw out there that kind of ties a little bit of all this together, and hooks it a little bit to today's news as well. One of the things one of the benefits to kind of being on the road all the time in all of these states, talking about all this voucher legislation, in addition to accruing a lot of sky miles, is you see that every single bill that these guys are pushing in every single one of these states is basically the same bill. And so this history that Fred outlined and these sort of the deep dive that Paige went into Texas, sort of there's a little bit of nuance in each one of these states, but for the most part, we're talking about this national push to ram vouchers into states across the country to the point where each of these bills is more or less like there's some tiny details involved. The budgets are different, but this is a national push to push vouchers into the states, and that's really, really important to remember for a couple of reasons. Number one, uh, you're hearing probably as we speak right now at some fancy ceremony in the White House, a lot of this noise about returning education to the states. Except that that's not what's actually happening, right? What's actually happening is they're just trying to roll back supports and services for kids across the country and replace them with these voucher schemes, legislation that they wrote in Washington and then shoehorned into each state's legislative process, finding someone who'll carry the bill and put it forward under the name of in our case last week Texas, the case before that Tennessee, Idaho, wherever else that they're trying to do this year. So that's just important to remember. This is a national push. It's not about returning education to the states. Um, but I wanted to kind of just hone in a little bit on something that both Fred and Paige raised in this space about this returning, pulling dollars back from the states, pushing vouchers through. You know, the Texas bill that I testified on, that Paige testified on, that dozens and dozens of other people testified on after we went throughout the night. It's very, very explicit, as are the bills that Fred mentioned, as is the federal tax credit voucher scheme that Jessica mentioned at the top, ECA. They're very explicit that this isn't really about parents' rights at all. This isn't really about giving parents choices. This is about giving private schools the choice for which kids to admit and which not to. And in the Texas legislation, it actually carves out this language that that the private schools get to just do whatever they want to, um, as long as it's consistent with their religious creed or values, which is fairly common in all the legislation. And then there's this other phrase that's in the bill that I haven't seen as frequently, where they say also the schools can make any determination they want according to their educational mission, which is sort of this new strange. I'll leave it to the lawyers to say whether educational mission is a protected category when it comes to discriminatory behavior. I suspect that it's not, but I'll defer to the JDs here on the call. Um, why does that? What does that have to do with the Department of Education today? Right, this big ceremony they're doing in the White House. Listen, uh, states, if they choose to, have resources and have infrastructure to provide adequate education to kids and families in their communities. The states have funding to do this. The question is, will they and do they? And often the answer, sadly, is no. Um, but it's important to remember that when it comes to the federal role here, right, it took the US government saying that states had to provide adequate education to kids regardless of whether they came from a wealthy family or a low-income family. It took the US government saying you have to provide an adequate education to kids who have disabilities. You have to provide an adequate education to rural kids, not just to kids in wealthy suburbs, and urban kids, not just in kids in wealthy suburbs. You have to provide some form of school stability for housing insecure kids. You have to provide some form of nutrition for kids in schools who may be coming to school undernourished. It took the US government saying this and putting that in place for all of the states, not just the states that decided to choose to. So when we're talking about rolling education back to the states, of course, number one, it's silly because these folks are actually just pushing voucher schemes into states across the country. But even if you take seriously this language about returning education to the states, let's talk exactly about what that means. It means giving states the ability to make increasing choices about which kids to serve, how to allocate resources to kids, and maybe to kind of shortchange kids with disabilities, kids from historically underserved communities, be they rural or be they urban, to make cuts to any supports that they might be making using federal money to provide nutritional services or to provide services to kids who may be housing insecure, and on and on and on and on. And the theme there that's consistent with this voucher legislation too, right, we're not talking necessarily about the state governments making those choices about who to serve and who not to serve, or who to underserve and who to overserve, but we're giving the schools those choices in those cases, those private schools. At the end of the day, the common thread here is it's not parents that are getting choices. It's not individual kids, regardless of need or background, that are necessarily getting served. What the administration is doing right now, in sort of a two-pronged approach, is trying to increasingly push a voucher bill through Congress that would force vouchers into states that don't want them, and on the other side, roll back a lot of the requirements that we've built up over time as an American society, that says through our both values and our legal code and our funding priorities that kids of all backgrounds need to be served. Those are the kind of common elements today. And I think it's really, really important to remember that, especially going out there right now when you're going to hear a lot of rhetoric about parents' rights and parents' choices being increased. And you're going to hear a lot of rhetoric about returning dollars to the states. Neither of which is true. And in fact, they're both being packaged in a way that's really going to leave a lot of vulnerable communities in particular out in the cold and on their own for help and supports moving forward. I want to really hone in on that and underscore that I know everybody listening understands that. But it can kind of get lost sometimes when we're talking about departments and agencies and titles and funding streams and bills and budget processes and all this stuff. It really, at the end of the day, we're talking about kids and families that are getting left out in these multiple ways, whether through these voucher schemes by design or through increasingly this kind of celebratory approach to rolling back decades of services and supports for kids at the federal level. Those are the things I think we need to be talking about when it comes to serving these kids and families. And that's, I think, certainly what I'm going to be doing. I think a lot of us on the call are going to be doing as well. So I do appreciate everyone listening and happy to move forward as we have planned today.
Thank you so much, Josh. Great points. Very well said. Before we turn to audience Q&A, in the spirit of providing the latest updates, I just want to take a moment to alert everyone to the newest, so I think is the newest form of voucher programs that we're seeing and tracking, and some of the latest PFPS tools. So most of you may know about tax credit scholarship vouchers, in which individuals or corporations give money to third-party organizations, often called scholarship granting organizations, and then those SGOs hand out the vouchers. Of course, these are simply vouchers by just another name and a different funding mechanism than conventional vouchers, but with all the same harms. And the federal ECA proposal is a tax credit voucher program. So of course, important to call those vouchers and name them. And the research on all the different harms and what everyone has talked about today applies just as much to them as to ESAs or conventional vouchers. But another form of voucher connected to tax mechanisms that's going more under the radar are what we're calling large-scale reimbursable tax credits for individuals. So for a long time, many states have had smaller scale programs to provide reimbursements for families' education expenses, maybe on the order of a few hundred or a couple $1,000s, which is not good, but we are starting, as of a couple of years ago, to see these programs at full conventional voucher amounts of $5,000, $6,000, $7,000. And of course, these, even more than other forms of vouchers, are generally only accessible to wealthier families who can front the cost of private school and wait to get an individual tax reimbursement. Oklahoma passed such a program with universal eligibility. I believe they were first, and then Alabama has also passed such a program, and there are lots of these proposals in other states. So individual large-scale reimbursable tax credit vouchers, don't let them fly under the radar in your state. Call them out as vouchers. We're here to help you oppose them, and PFPS will help you keep identifying these newer forms of vouchers and threats to public education funding and students. On that note, I want to remind everyone that the Public Funds Public Schools Voucher Bill Tracker, which is accessible from the homepage of our website, is tracking every voucher bill that we identify in every state legislature and the U.S. Congress, categorizing them, summarizing them, and providing you with information. You can search by your state, you can search by year, you can search by a keyword like universal eligibility and see all the programs proposed this year or in past years with that criteria. We urge you to use that. Contact us if something is missing, and we hope that's helpful to you. We also, a few months ago, launched our private school data dashboard, also accessible on the PFPS website under the Interactive Tools tab. And with that tool, you can see for any state the percentage of students in private school, the percentage of private schools that are religious. You can see where both public and private schools are located in your state, in suburbs, in cities in rural communities where, of course, there are many fewer private schools. You can see the income and race breakdown of private schools versus public schools in your state. So we urge you to use and take and snip out and paste on your tools any of those graphs and maps. You can even see in your state private schools, private school use by county. So please use those, download those, and feel free to get in touch with PFPS if you need help with that data. And we're putting all these links in the chat. We will also email out to everyone on this webinar all of these resources from everyone here. Finally, our newest tool from Education Law Center and Public Funds Public Schools is our universal voucher price tag tool. This is a tool that very powerful but pretty straightforward to use, where you can select for any state, you select the voucher amount, and you also select what you want it to estimate for what percentage of public school students and private school students would use the voucher, and it gives you the total cost of that voucher, the price tag, for your state, as well as what amount of that total price tag would be going to support kids who are already in private school or homeschooling. So again, you can contact us if you need help with that tool or you want to dig into the data. ELC's research director, Dr. Danielle Ferry, will be very happy to help you with that, and we hope that that is useful to you in your advocacy too. So I do want to take a moment to let the panel tell us about any recent advocacy tools from your organization or others that you want to highlight.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that. And Jessica and to PFPS, ELC, thank y'all so much. These tools and resources have been invaluable for state level advocates. I mean, I've personally used the private school demographics tracker, right, and meetings with lawmakers. And so I want to encourage everybody to use those resources. And we have a lot of resources for the states that we are doing active state level advocacy opposing vouchers as well. If you go to our website, idra.org, and go to our Stop Vouchers webpage, we have a whole lot of resources. So especially if you are in Texas or, connected to Texas and looking for resources and ways and talking points for how to advocate to keep the public in public schools. Great landing page there, which includes actually many of the resources from my amazing partners here. A couple of resources in particular, I just want to flag. We have a map. I have an amazing colleague, Dr. Joanna Sanchez, who understands GIS and maps and has brilliantly come up with a way to map around and track actually where a private school is relative to the public schools and charter schools in this throughout the state. And you can look at that by House district, by Senate district, statewide, right? And by school district. And so just a really powerful tool for you to target, a particular member, your representative, maybe a Texas House of Representative member who might be on the fence about vouchers. So wanted to flag that resource in addition to our resource around the cost of private school vouchers. So we also have a tool that builds on the PFPS data and other national and state data to figure out, depending on the number of students who are projected to leave a public school and go to a private school, what the potential fiscal impact of that at various rates. So those are two really, really great tools that I want to flag, and shout out to our amazing team for putting those together.
Paige.
Yeah, I just want to highlight just a couple things. I think they were included in the chat earlier, but hopefully we can pull them back up again. But we have two links on our website that really provides the citations for most of my comments earlier about the history of private schools across the nation. And so how they developed and then the development of segregation academies as well. We also have a number of fact sheets on school vouchers and general talking points, elevating a number of issues, facts versus myths. We also have a newsletter that we try to publish every other week. We talk about a number of different issues in there. It's called Our Bottom Line, and oftentimes we give real time sort of news coverage on what's taking place across the South as it relates to school vouchers. In addition to all these resources, I mean, we work with a number of coalitions and partners who have great resources as well. So we're all just trying to put this information out there. But I will share one more SCF resource. In the late fall, we put out a pretty enormous report called Miles to Go, and it's the state of Black education in America. And we have a pretty hefty section about school vouchers as well, in addition to about 6 or 7 other chapters. But it goes into the history and then also the current day context of how school vouchers are faring and developing across the country as well. So I can put a link to that too. But thank you for the opportunity to share some additional resources.
Yeah, Fred.
And I'll just jump in real quick. It's not my resource, but I find it quite clever. I don't know if you mentioned this earlier, Jessica, but the Institute for Taxation and Policy released a brief earlier this week. I put the link in the chat right now, and they unpack kind of what ECA means. Sometimes I think it can get really confusing what the tax credit version of this stuff is. It basically just means that rich donors can divert what they owe in federal taxes or state taxes in the previous versions of these bills at the state level into voucher middleman organizations that pay out vouchers instead of what they owe in taxes. The rest of it's pretty much the same as a typical voucher, but I just put the link in the chat of this bill analysis, and one really clever thing they do is not only explain how this works in this complicated way, but they actually also went through and explained the tax shelter piece of this, which is just another awful layer on top of the voucher piece, which is just a way for tax avoidance and tax shelter for very, very wealthy people. And they went through in a very clever went through some of the wealthiest donors behind voucher political lobbying and advocacy, everyone from Betsy DeVos to Charles Koch to Jeff Yes to some others. And they explained how much, based on previously reported tax liabilities, they could save through this tax shelter version if it passes next year, while ramming vouchers into the state. So I encourage you to take a look at that too, and see what's really at stake when it comes to that particular federal voucher bill.
Great. Thanks for flagging that, Josh. And we will gather all of these resources and be sending them out to attendees so you'll have all the links. I am going to turn to some of the great questions from our audience now. I'm going to put a few together here about how vouchers affect various groups of students. So what are your thoughts toward lawmakers who say that vouchers will go to low-performing students in public schools to boost literacy and achievement? What are the effects of vouchers on students with disabilities? And what happens to children that no voucher school wants? So feel free to take any part of that question and anyone can jump in.
Happy to kick it off since I alluded to this a little bit in my comments earlier. So this is a debate that is, like I said, I really think there's a good faith debate happening about this precise question. What about our most vulnerable students in the Texas House, at least? And one of the interesting nuances of the Texas legislation that in both House Bill 3 and in SB 2, there's this interesting provision. It is a universal voucher, and it creates, to the extent that there are more voucher applications than there are vouchers available, ESAs available, it creates a sort of tiered, staggered eligibility system. And in theory, it's supposed to prioritize the neediest students most. But when we really drill down and we look at it, the formula actually says that students and families up to 500% of the federal poverty line, could be in the pool in the lottery system for eligibility. What does that mean? I'm bad at math, but 500% of the poverty line is, a pretty middle class income family, right? About $160,000 for a family of 4, for example. This is not the same category, right, of family and, access as a family that's at the federal poverty line, right, or 100% of it. So there's some, I think, cheeky ways that proponents of vouchers are trying to suggest that, these populations are going to be served. Similarly, the House version of the bill would allow up to $30,000 for a student with a documented disability, right? Of course, the documentation has to happen at the public school expense, which is also problematic. But here we go again, even though that money in theory is in the bill, there's, I think, only 5 or 6 schools, maybe 12 schools across the state that actually accept and serve and really focus on students with disabilities. And the vast majority of them do not and actually can reject them. So I think it's important for us as advocates to be smart policy advocates, number one, and to hold, policymakers and proponents accountable for the words they are using and for the ways that they will, be operationalized in the practical reality. And so we know that they won't work, they won't serve all students, and the only institutions that do that are our public schools, and that's why we should fund them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just sort of remind everyone that the voucher is only as good as the school that's willing to take your child, and really, it sort of has very little to do with parent control of the situation and everything to do with the schools doing the choosing. And this is partly why you see this artifact in every state that's accepted vouchers, that three-quarters of voucher users are already in private school to begin with. It's because the screening process already happened in those cases, and there's only availability for the kids who are already in the schools there. So just remember that when you're going back out into communities, the voucher's only as good as the school is willing to take the child that we're talking about, and I think that's the real severe limitation. It's also the problem with the idea in the first place. Is this is not just like some quirky artifact of a regulatory structure or how it got implemented or any of the silliness that these guys like talk about to try to explain the negative results and discrimination impact. The whole point is the schools doing the choosing. This is why the idea exists.
And just real quick too, I was trying to find this on my computer to make sure I was accurate in saying this. Even the programs that are limited to students with disabilities or to a certain subgroup of students are oftentimes are still discriminatory. So for example, the students with special needs scholarship program in South Carolina, most of the families who participated in that program are wealthy families. And they earn double the amount of median income than the average family in South Carolina. So wealthier families are taking advantage of the scholarship program for students with disabilities in South Carolina compared to the overall average, despite the fact that it is still targeted to a special needs population. And so the overall problem, which I think we all alluded to, and I certainly did, is that fact that operationalizing these programs often still doesn't happen in a very equal way that gives everyone access to the same programs, even if you limit it, which is a part of the program. And I think this distracts us from the overall conversation of how do you improve outcomes for kids. It actually doesn't come down to the fact that they're linked to vouchers. It comes down to other items such as teacher preparation, school funding, early childhood education, high dosage tutoring. It has to do with these core elements that oftentimes that we don't talk about. And I even say this, and I know we have in our discussions, is the public school may not be perfect and it certainly needs to be strengthened. But the fact is vouchers are just simply not the answer. And oftentimes the people who are participating in these programs end up worse, despite the fact of even the good intentions to try to limit the programs to a special population. It just still doesn't like pan out.
Thank you. All such important points. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to read you another question from our audience. What is the ultimate goal with the folks pushing these schemes? If there is overwhelming research and knowledge about how ineffective and frankly racist these programs are, why is there a scheme to push this narrative to our communities at the national level and in our states? And the question asker said helping to spell this out might be really helpful for parents and community members and advocates.
I will give my perspective first. I'm just excited. Sorry. I think there really is a debate that parental choice matters more than student outcome. And to me, I think proponents of voucher programs says it's the parent's right to have a choice. Even that choice actually ends up being worse for the student. And to me, I think that is wrong. We have to have student-centered approaches to our policies to look at what is best for kids. And I don't think we should be hiding behind the fact that just choice is the ultimate factor when we know choices by themselves just don't work, especially as it relates to the voucher programs. So I think that's why it's being pushed. It's like this guy said, just make sure that parents have a choice. And in fact, we're not actually centering what we know works in the classroom.
I would just say that a lot of this is about is part of the same larger conversation that we're having in lots of other areas across the country, right? It's the same reason that you have all these people trying to pull books out of libraries. It's the same reason that you have an entire GOP Congress that's just falling all over itself to cut Medicaid that serves a third of families across the country vital healthcare services. It's the same flippancy and recklessness that you have Elon Musk talking about Social Security as a Ponzi scheme and just laying off Social Security workers who take phone calls from frustrated seniors who can't get their payments, right? All these are actually part of the same idea, which is just completely dismantling longstanding commitments and supports to vulnerable folks, whether they're kids and families, whether they're folks who are desperate for healthcare solutions, whether they're for kids, seniors who need retirement. I mean, all this is part of the same conversation. It's not an accident that we're having this version of the conversation in education today, while the White House is rolling back some of this stuff in the public education space. And, you know, yesterday, the day before that, and I'm sure tomorrow we're going to hear more news on the healthcare front, the retirement front, and everything else. Like, if you have to talk about these things as all part of this larger rollback of commitments to supports for vulnerable families and to working families across the country. And I think it's just really, really important to talk about these things as all part of this larger push. And it's not an accident that all of it's coming from a handful of some of the wealthiest people on the planet, frankly.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in to offer to build on what was shared because I think both of my co-presenters were right. And I mean, I'll just take the part about, you know, if it's racist, why are we doing it? I mean, I'll invoke the words of the immortal, you know, Maya Angelou. When someone shows you who they are, believe them. Right? And, you know, you've heard now several of us, you know, all of us in many ways talk about the inextricable way that privatization, school choice, parental rights, all of that rhetoric and the associated policy is unequivocally tied up with with our nation's really problematic history with slavery, segregation, and anti-Black racism. And so on its face, at best, we should be cautious, right? And policymakers should, you know, pause and think about that history and, those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it, that sort of thing. And the way that I know that, you know, not all, genuinely, you know, I think there are, you know, some, if not many policymakers who are legitimately interested in vouchers as an exercise of school reform, right? But to the extent that we take seriously the history and the association of racism and, you know, segregation with vouchers, we would do something. We don't have to put our head in the sands, right? So we would do things like add in anti-discrimination provisions. We would say straight up, you can't discriminate on the basis of race, sex, gender, national origin, religion, right? We would say that because it's that important that we know that we don't want that sort of thing to happen. We've offered those amendments, right? We've drafted them and they get rejected. We would put in protections for students with disabilities, for English language learners who also would have to check their federal civil rights and their state civil rights at the door, right? And so again, someone shows you are, believe them. I also just want to flag that it's not there's not a lot of nuance here. I mean, we have folks literally talking about the need for vouchers because of this broader climate of challenging anti-racism, pushing out, to Fred's point, you know, books that are inclusive and excellent, right, and representative of all of us. And so the last thing I'll just say on this point is that I think setting aside the, you know, sort of discriminatory intent and impact, at least by some policymakers and advocates, there's a different vision of public education, right? I think for us, at least here on this panel, for many of you out there, we have a vision of public education that is about developing a multiracial, pluralistic society, right? And inculcating those sorts of values. And I think those, it's a little bit cynical, but I think it's true. I think those who are in the voucher camp, you know, really view education as a vehicle of economic production and almost kids as widgets. And that's just not the vision that we have at our organization. And we don't think it's the vision that was contemplated by, for example, here in Texas, our founding fathers and those of, I think, every other state in the nation.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Josh Cowen, who I know just had to hop off, Paige Duggins-Clay, Fred Jones. Thank you also to those behind the scenes at Education Law Center, Wendy Lecker, Caitlin Comasania, Sharon Krangle, for getting this off the ground and making this possible. And thank you to our wonderful audience. It is such a hectic time and we appreciate you all being here. We appreciate the wisdom and knowledge from our panel. And we look forward to seeing you and everyone else again soon in the PFPS webinar series and all the wonderful advocacy efforts that you're undertaking. Please be in touch so that we can help and support you. And good luck to everybody in your incredibly important work that you're doing now. Thank you for joining us today.